Hello, everyone. We can't say good morning or good afternoon because we have people from all over the world today joining us both as presenters and participants. We're fortunate in many ways to be able to do this again for the first time in a couple of years. We had initially done these rights programs in person, and I'm sure we're going to get back to it. Kris Kliemann, our chair, is a big fan of the important role that Bisg can play in bringing together the rights community. But because we had both a program and a set of participants who come from all over the world, we wanted to be able to do it virtually this time. This 2-hour program is going to have several different components. We're going to hear from Willem Bisseling, literary agent at Sebes and Bisseling, literary agency, and we'll be talking with Pamela Malpas, who's with the Jennifer Lyons literary agent, and also a very active member of our rights committee. We'll also hear from Lara Allen, who's rights director at Wattpad, who's going to be in conversation with Kris Kliemann at Kliemann and Company. We have a really interesting presentation from Nina Sabak, who's director of Research and Editorial at Market Partners International, a New York-based firm, and Nina represents the West Coast office in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And finally, we'll hear from Scott Hoffman at International Literary Properties. You might know International ILP as a firm that's been acquiring and managing a portfolio of literary estates. It's a different approach to rights models that we'll be able to feature. And along the way, we have a couple of things that we're going to announce at the Rights Committee, and that'll be fun, but we're going to save those for later. We're looking forward to getting started now with Willem to talk about the work that you've been doing, particularly with respect to carving out new forms of rights.
And there's me. And I'm talking to Pamela, right? Or Pamela's talking to me.
Correct. So I'll start briefly, unless Willem, you want to make an introduction for yourself. I just wanted to sort of lay the groundwork for this, which is a discussion of Dutch language rights, English language rights, English export editions into the Dutch market, and the background for this would be that for anybody who's working in the rights world, that's whether they're at an agency or at a publisher's rights department, the question of how export editions affect the translation market is familiar. Today's conversation has quite an interesting twist that incorporates some socio-cultural change and logistical challenges, and a really interesting new approach to problem solving. So Willem Bisseling of Sebes and Bisseling is going to tell us something about forces shaping the Dutch rights market and how they are approaching a response to those challenges.
Yeah, well, thank you, Pamela, for introducing. A little bit about myself. I started working at the book business 16 years ago. And I think a lot of things have changed in the business. Well, a lot of things have changed in the business, but especially when it comes to the topic you're just announcing. What we see, well, what the most people who are listening know is that the Netherlands always were like a very interesting territory to sell rights in, because we have quite a large reading audience. I think till a few years ago, the Dutch paid quite high prices for advances. They were always the first ones to buy the rights, the translation rights for books, or they were among the first 5 big countries. And what we have been seeing in the last couple of years, is that the English language editions are slowly and the last years fastly taken over more of the market. And a few months ago, well, it was in April when we were at the London Book Fair, we were having this discussion with an agent. What can we do about it? Because I was looking at the top 100 bestseller list, and I saw that 17%, of all the books in the top 100 were original English books. Also books that were in translation. So if you look, for instance, at Colleen Hoover, everywhere, but also here in Holland, Colleen Hoover, you looked at the numbers of It Ends With Us, they were like 10 times or maybe 15 times higher than the Dutch edition. And then we went a little bit deeper into, we dove a little bit deeper into that list, and we saw way more books that sold so incredibly well in their original language, that we were thinking, okay, what's happening here? We knew, well, we already knew that a lot of Dutch people can read English, but that they also are doing it constantly. That was kind of a different thing to see. And there are like examples enough. Michelle Obama, 300,000 books in Dutch, which is perfectly fine, nothing to complain, but another 120 or 130,000 in English. And if the Dutch publisher could have sold those 130,000 copies, they would have made a lot more money, of course. Also known that the books sold here in English, you know, the amount of money the publisher puts into marketing, into publicity. For the Dutch edition, the English edition is doing very well on that marketing and publicity as well. So that being said, we were having this conversation with an agent of, well, mostly new adult and romance, Kimberly Brouwer. And she said, what can we do about it? And I said, well, I don't know. I think the only thing we can do about it is to accept that Holland nowadays is a bilingual country. And maybe we should try to make it happen that Dutch publishers can compete with the import editions by publishing them in the original language. And that was actually the start of the whole conversation. What is possible? How can we do that? Is it possible? And that difference from who we're talking to, because American agents are a little bit more open to it than British agents, for instance, or British publishers. But Kimberly said to me, "Oh, there are possibilities," because she said, "You know, when I'm selling UK rights to the UK, then I always sell non-exclusively for distribution in Europe. So yeah, why not? Let's try." And that's how it all started. And we have been talking to a lot of people about it since then, and to see, you know, what are the possibilities. And now, since 2 months, since 2 months, we sold like a handful of we call it now Dutch English rights. We still haven't found the right way to put it, but Dutch English rights to a Dutch publisher, and it's a start of something. We don't know what's gonna happen with it, but we think and we hope that it's a way for Dutch publishers to compete with the import editions, because there's another problem we have. Well, everyone reads English, that's perfectly fine, but the other problem is that we have a fixed price in Holland, which means that when you have translation costs and etc., you know, you have to ask quite a price for a translated book. But the English import edition, there's no fixed price on the English books, because the fixed price is on the Dutch language. So every import edition can be sold for any price a bookseller wants, and that's what we see a lot, of course. That you know, you have the translation of Sally Rooney, which is 30 euros because it's a big book, but then there's an import edition of 15 or 16 euros, and a lot of people say, well, you know, that's quite a big difference, 15 euros. And why would I buy the Dutch book if I can read English anyway? And there was just last week a big report by the Royal Dutch Booksellers Foundation on why people read in English here in Holland. And 41% says, well, just because we can. That's why we read in English. Another 40% said, because we want to learn more about the language. We know the language, but we want to learn a little bit more. And then there's also a percentage that says, well, we buy it in English because it's faster available, or we buy it in English because it is available, or we buy it in English because it's cheaper. So, but that's kind of the range, what we're talking about. And well, to get back to that point, what we really want to give Dutch publishers the opportunity to at least compete with an import edition, because now they can't compete at all. There is the import edition, you can do nothing about it. It's there, and you just have your Dutch language edition, and that's what it is. So yeah,
So I mean, it's an interesting, you place this discussion as having begun in at the London Book Fair this year. This consideration of English language rights, specifically within the Dutch market, I think for those of us in the rights business, we know has always been there because of the high level of English language literacy in Holland, and the proximity of UK editions. It's a ferry right away, even if it were not already in the bookshop down the road. So that I think that has always just historically been a consideration. And as you point out, in years past, Dutch rights as sort of the parcel of European language rights would be something that agents and publishers would prioritize to sell first. It would be one of the first language rights you sold. But there was also just generally a timing consideration, as people were aware that once an edition was available in the UK market and there was any export or for you import edition available, it would create a conflict for the Dutch publisher. So it really sounds like what has happened now is just an acceleration of English readership, of English literacy, and of maybe particularly for younger people, living their lives almost entirely in English because of social media, because of television.
Because of everything, because the whole education system these days in Holland is English. Well, not on the primary schools, but I have a 4.5-year-old daughter. Actually, yesterday or 2 days ago, she came home and she explained me the rainbow in all her colors in English, and I said, "What? What were you just saying?" And she said, "That's English, Papa." I said, "I know it's English, but you had actually English class while you're 4.5 years old." So that's the new situation. Our universities or the higher education, everything is in English these days. And it makes sense. And I think Holland has always been a very international oriented country, like for centuries already. So it does make sense. But I also see that, you know, if I look, I'm 40, so I'm from the 80s. My generation learned English from television and from radio, and you know, we speak perfectly fine English, but it's not, you know, we're fluent in a way, but it's not, you hear an accent. With this new generation, they don't even have an accent anymore. They are bilingual, and that's because of TikTok, that's because of Instagram, that's because of everything that's on social media. That also means that when they start reading in high school or in primary school, they start reading YA in English. And it's not that those children in 10 years, when they're 25, all of a sudden, well, not all of a sudden, in 10 years, they're 25, that all of a sudden they're going to read Dutch because they're used to English. There's also been a report about dyslexia. 1.5% of all people in the world has dyslexia. That's like the average. In Holland, it's 15%. That's not possible. It's not possible that when we have a dyslexia rate, that it's 10 times higher than in the rest of the world. I think, I'm not a scientist, this is no science, but I think that a lot of people are not dyslexic. They're just not able to read well in their own language, in Dutch. And I think that's the big problem, you know, that's underneath the surface. But that's a big problem for us right now, because we are losing a reader's audience in our own language, and that has effect on the rights business in the end.
Right. I mean, it really creates an existential challenge for how the rights business goes forward, how publishers choose to spend their money on translation, which books they invest in translation on. If people are going to read the English edition in English, then they'll spend their translation money on Japanese books or what have you, which makes it harder for all of us in the rights business to find room for our own projects. So, so maybe let's talk more about the solution to this problem. So we have this barrier for translation rights, both for sellers who are trying to find a buyer for their book in the Dutch market, for Dutch booksellers and Dutch publishers and Dutch rights agents. You spoke quickly about how this new system, this new concept will could work. But my understanding then is that so for an American rights seller or British rights seller, English language rights owner, we might see the Dutch market as a comparatively small proportion of the overall English language market. In the Dutch market, obviously, it's huge because it is your entire market, as is the Dutch language market, your entire market. So the consideration for those of us on the rights selling side is to consider whether that what we would think of as a proportionally small portion of rights could be carved out separately on a non-exclusive basis. And so what this does then is to introduce a new edition without taking anything away. Is that correct? So the world we've been operating in is that we would have our US edition, or perhaps a UK edition, that is being exported to Holland. But we would also, of course, be trying to sell Dutch translation rights. So we already have those two things. And you're not saying that either of those is going away. You're trying to add a new English language edition that originates in Holland. So nothing is taken away, something is added.
No, actually, we can't take it away because, you know, there's something like free shipping of goods. We all can ship goods all over the world. So we're not taking away anything. The only thing we're taking away is kind of exclusivity. Sorry for that. Exclusivity for the mostly UK and US market to sell their books into our territory. And you know, for instance, we now just we now see it with what we see with new adult. We see it even with romance. We even see it with crime. It used to be just the high literature and business. That used to be, you know, that's a problem for a long time already. But now it's every genre, and political nonfiction, for instance. A lot of people read it in English. So now there's Maggie Haberman with her new book on Donald Trump, Confidence Man. What you have with those kind of titles is that those books are delivered mostly very late to publication date because of a lot of secrets, etc. That means we don't have, the publisher doesn't have time to translate in time. So what we now did with Maggie Haberman is we sold the Dutch English rights and the Dutch translation rights, because that's something we say to the publishers here: you have to buy both. Or you have to buy translation rights, and if you want to buy Dutch English rights, you also have to buy the translation rights. So there is an extra in it for the author and for the agents to contract. But because the publisher is not able to produce the book in time for the translation, because the translation is not ready because of the text is so late, they now can publish the English edition already on, I don't know, what is it, 4 October from the top of my head, and then the Dutch edition comes out on I don't know, 18 November or something like that. That are 2 editions, but there's also the import edition. And what we see is that the Dutch edition, the Dutch language edition, is like 30 euros because you have to, you know, with all the translation costs and all. The English edition from the Dutch publisher is 19 euros, but I also saw it already for like 12.60 or 12.80 from the, I guess, the UK or the US, I don't know. But yeah, all of a sudden there are 3 editions, and it's up to the buyer or the consumer which one he wants to buy. And I think that also with this, what we're doing now is that you can create a Dutch English, an English edition specifically for the Dutch market. Yes. You know, Dutch, especially young people, also been in that report I was just mentioning. Especially young people go for a beautiful book. They want like a little piece of art. We all know that import editions mostly are not the most beautiful books, but we can. So the Dutch publisher now can really focus on how do we want this book in the original language to look. You know, what do our consumers want? So yeah, it's adding. I think it's adding a value. It's adding something to the market. At the same time, of course, the UK, US, and everyone in the world is totally free to sell their books into our territories as well. It's not exclusively, absolutely not. Right.
Yeah, and for the rights sellers' point of view, I think It offers a couple of very obvious appealing things. One is a new advance, which we all want to have an additional advance of some kind.
Yeah.
Money in
It's
the
always
pocket
good. It's always
now
good to
rather
have
than
an
later.
additional advance.
And then the possibility of, well, as you say, localized marketing, which I think has always been part of the discussion about whether how an export or import edition works versus a local edition in terms of the kind of marketing support, the localized publicity, the kinds of things that only a local publisher can do. But then also the home royalty, so that rather than getting that reduced export royalty for those books that are sold in the Dutch English edition, have a higher royalty rate applied. So there's some very interesting, appealing, financial elements to it, as well as just the interesting sort of intellectual challenge of how we can make this work.
But we also, sorry to interrupt, but we also do understand why some, especially export departments, don't like the idea, because of course export is a big thing. I think I read, if I'm right about the numbers, that 40% of the income for UK publishers are from export. That's from export, of course, all over the world, but still 40% is quite a lot of money. And so yeah, they're not happy with it also because the export royalty, like you just said, the royalty rate for export is quite low. So the author and the agent, also think about the agent, are not making a lot of money with export editions. And what we try to do, we give a chance to the author to make a little bit more on his or her original book, just by letting it be sold by another person, by another party.
Right. I mean, I think part of what is interesting here is just the application of things that we've been doing all along, but applying them in a very localized way, which has been true of rights selling anyway, that we sell rights individually for individual markets differerly. We sell Chinese language rights in one way, we sell French language rights in another way. And so the sort of constant challenge of knowing your local market, knowing the rights you're selling, and solving local problems is a really interesting, it's part of what makes the rights business exciting, is that there are always new challenges and new ways to address them. I should be leaving time for outside questions. I mean, I certainly have questions about, as this moves forward, it'll be interesting to see differences for people who are experimenting in this area between rights being granted by an agent or negotiations you're having with an agent versus a publisher's rights department, where the publisher, of course, is going to be thinking and feeling much more painfully the export decisions, more so than a literary agent would, but still creating opportunities for.
Yeah, and at the same time, I think one of the main reasons to decline literary novels, for instance, is that Dutch publishers always say people will buy this in English. So when it comes to nonfiction and literature, people say that we're not going to buy the translation rights because people will buy it in English. So I do think that it also creates extra attention for books. So I think it creates extra deals. It creates an extra broad span of books we actually can get into the stores, because now people, if they normally said, we can buy that because people buy the English edition, now we say, okay, but you're allowed to sell the English edition next to a Dutch edition. So I think I hope we create some extra space for translation rights as well.
Indeed, and whether this means a fragmentation of a market that already exists, meaning the people who would be reading in English and might be reading the British edition or might be reading now a Dutch English edition, whether that's a fragmenting or maybe it's an expansion. Maybe there are people who we'll just have to see.
We'll see.
Yeah. So a couple of questions have come in. I think we've been talking, of course, specifically about the Dutch market, but there's a question about whether there are other countries that have similar market issues, and I would guess that this would be true in other Scandinavian markets. Are there other markets where you think that this challenge and the solution?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I think it's just a matter of time. I know, and that's what I hear from a lot of clients we represent from the US, is that the Germans are very much complaining about all the import editions. Although I think that in Germany it's still not the percentage that we're having, but it's growing because, well, the new generation in Germany is also fluent in English. But we were in Gothenburg last week at the book fair, and we talked to a lot of Danes and Swedes and Norwegians and Finns. And yeah, well, the CEO of mostly every big company there wanted to talk to us how we did it. And of course, there are differences. Some of those territories have fixed prices, some don't. The territories are smaller, but if you look at those languages, then especially Sweden, Norway, Denmark are having issues with, well, are having the same issues. Look at, and they all say Sally Rooney is one of the examples, and I think that's because she, of course, is a millennial writer. She's read by a lot of millennials who are all fluent in English, so they read in English, and there you really see the differences, or well, the issues they have to work with, or they have to work with in their territories. And you see in some territories it did work because of a very good marketing strategy, and they could maybe publish a little earlier or whatever. That sometimes the translation did work. In other territories, I think like in Norway, it was the English edition sold 10 times more than the Norwegian edition. So yeah, they are having the similar problems. And we also have it with commercial stuff like Richard Osman with the Thursday Murder Club. I was in Oslo last year, and I walked into a bookstore, and I saw this whole wall of Richard Osman. I was like, oh, that's great news, because we are selling him. That's great news. So Richard Osman's all over the place in English. So okay, that was not what I wanted to see. So yeah, they're having the same issues, and they're absolutely eagerly looking at what's happening here and what's gonna happen. But I don't think I said it, but it's a test case. We have to see, and it doesn't mean that if you publish an English book, well, in Norway or in Denmark or in Holland, that all of a sudden it's going to happen. That all of a sudden it's going to be a bestseller. I think we have to be very, you have to be very keen on what you're trying to sell. Right. But for some genres, it will absolutely be effective, I think. Yeah.
So we're coming close on our time, and some questions have come in. One was an interesting one about the variations in English language editions. So if there were already, say, a British edition and a US edition with their associated spelling differences and so on, that within the Dutch market, is one of those preferred over the other? And then in the Dutch English edition, does that adopt British spellings? How different do they look?
I think no. Well, I think it depends on the author. I think we go for the spelling of the original the original book.
Yeah.
We both read UK and US books, so that doesn't matter. Yeah. That doesn't matter to the Dutch reader, I think. Yeah. So no. So it's closer to the original.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Of course. That's interesting. Yeah. Yeah. And then a relevant question from someone about whether or not there are outside the publishing industry, but cultural or governmental concerns or oversight of this erosion of local language rights. And Dutch is far from being a disappearing language, but as any language feels the influence, the exertion of English language strength against it. Is there a broader sense of?
I think that's a super interesting question, and that's something we are trying to get away in for years already, which seems next to impossible. I think that's the thing with the Dutch government. They're always, when it's too late, they finally find out that there's a problem, like with every government, I guess. But the thing is that we wrote pieces on this subject 7-8 years ago already. Newspaper said it's too small, the book business is too small, it's a niche. We were saying, okay, but it's about language. It's not only about our business, it's about our language, it's about our cultural heritage, it's about tradition. I spoke to at a dinner to a guy who's working for the government, and he was working on the Department of Language and Education, and he says, yeah, we do see that problem, but we just don't know yet how to address it. We said, for instance, speaking about the fixed price, why is there a fixed price on Dutch literature?
Yes,
and
which we barely touched on. Yes.
And not on the English language. It's pure false competition. A government can do something about it. They can say, okay, well, you have to, there's needs to be mentioned one price, and that's the price. And that's not something they're going to do because it's too small. I don't think that they are seeing that it's small, maybe business-wise, but it's not small society-wise. And that's something they are seeing. We see it. That's what I was mentioning about the dyslexia numbers. We see it with our children. The education level, the reading habits of our children are one of the lowest in Europe, and maybe even in the Western world. If we look at education at our schools, what they have to read for their reading lists when they're in the 6th grade, they're reading books that have been written before the 90s. That's what they need to read, and so we need a whole cultural change when it comes to Dutch literature and Dutch language skills. And that's a whole other story, and we are not helping by doing this, by the way. But we have to survive as well.
Yes, well, I mean, the book business is a culture business. Yeah. And the fact that it is involved in these cultural shifts and cultural responses only makes it more interesting. But it is a reminder that
absolutely.
Business is a culture business. Yeah.
No, it is. But it's not due to a lack of trying, and we really are trying to get more Dutch books into the market. But at the end, it's the consumer who buys the books, and if they want to buy English books, they buy English books. And if we produce them, or a British publisher or an American publisher, they do buy them. And that's it. But it's a very interesting topic, and something I personally really care about. I study Dutch language. So it's close to my heart, that topic, but it's something very interesting, and I think it's something we need to address to some people at our government and to talk about more. Yeah, absolutely.
Pamela, well, great. I just want to thank you for leading this conversation with Willem, and Willem, thank you for the time that you put into explaining this and outlining a little bit of the Dutch market. You both win the award for the largest time zones difference. Willem's 6 hours ahead of us, and Pamela is starting her day in the Bay Area. So that those 9 hours are precious, but also the only thing that Zoom can overcome, I guess. I wanted to also mention, I didn't in the introduction, that in addition to being a literary agent at Jennifer Lyons, that Pamela is now a board member at the Association of American Literary Agents, just starting, I think, this year. So. Thanks for making the time today, and I'd like to throw the presentation back to Kris Kliemann and Lara Allen.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Willem and Pamela. That was awesome. Thank you. Hi, Lara. We're gonna change tactics a bit here and talk about a different kind of business. I hope our participants will find the themes. What we're looking at is different ways of thinking about rights, businesses that are handling rights in new ways, and in the tradition of the Bisg Rights Committee, the tools that rights people use to analyze marketplaces and understand their business better. So Laura's going to talk to us about her position and work at Wattpad WEBTOONs, and I am going to put a little slideshow up. Not nervous, not at all. And there it is. Do we all see that?
I think so, yes.
Great.
Yeah.
You'll tell me when to shift through.
Yes, you can just, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. So first of all, thank you all for coming and joining me here. I just want to give a brief overview of what Wattpad is and what the philosophy of the company is, and the kind of stories that we publish and present, just to give some context for the further discussion. I don't, so Kris, if you can just go to the next slide.
I think I can. Why is it? There we go.
Excellent. Okay. So last November, Wattpad and WEBTOON joined together and merged. And what I want to concentrate on here are the terms fan-driven global entertainment. That's actually what I would like to kind of focus our discussion on. So just keep those in mind as we go forward through this discussion. I think this definition is a little different from at least my background. I've worked in rights for 20 years in both the agent side and the publishing side. And this is a new experience for me that I find very exciting and very interesting. So you can go to the next slide, Kris, if you'd like. Yeah. So this is just a general overview of Wattpad and WEBTOON Studios. I can say that 15 years ago, the company was created by Alan Yao and Ivan Yun, specifically to be global. I think this is important. They concentrated on making a platform that was going to be international. It's now, there are 50 different languages that you can access on the platform now. And it's the creators and the people that engage with that actually write the content, write in 30 different languages. And the average person spends 60 minutes on the platform every day. So it's really engaging people throughout the world. You can go to the next slide, thanks. So there's 4 imprints within Wattpad. I should have stayed on the last slide. I've just realized there was an important aspect, the thing that I wanted to mention. So there is in-house creator management. Those are people that deal directly with the creators and the writers, marketing and separate PR teams. Those creator managers act essentially as agents for those in terms of the type of relationship that they establish with authors. And we very much want to be collaborative and transparent. This is important throughout the platform. I think it's an important, it'll come into play within that definition of fan-based that I mentioned earlier. Okay, we can move to the next slide. Okay, so there within the actual book group, we Wattpad and WEBTOON, before I came, and I've been here since March, concentrated on establishing global publishing partners who would within their group have imprints that the agreement would have between 10 and 15 books per year that come from the Wattpad platform. Now in Spain, that can be Spanish language stories that are published originally in Spanish on Wattpad, and then PRH publishes 10 or 15 of those per year. They have dedicated people within Wattpad that present them with titles that according to whatever their boundaries or their requirements are for any given season. And so that was the initial concentration, but that's not going to work in every country, and not every country can support that kind of imprint. Not every country wants to do that. It's very, some people want more freedom to do what they want, and I was brought in to do individual title licensing. And Wattpad has 4 imprints. There's Wattpad Books, which is essentially the YA new adult imprint, which is what most people think of when they think of Wattpad. They think of young adult or new adult. W by Wattpad does adult books. Frayed Pages is your after imprint, essentially. Anything that's like after goes into Frayed Pages. And WEBTOON Unscrolled, it will be launching this fall. That is our print version of WEBTOONs. So that is a graphic novel imprint. So we can move to the next slide, I think. And this is just a general idea. The idea behind Wattpad that I think a lot of people have problems with is, why would someone buy a book when you can read it for free on the platform? And this is where the idea of fans come in. I think the platform was developed essentially as a way, it's a social media platform. So you will write up a story and you will get immediate feedback. And once somebody provides an immediate feedback and recognizes that you as an author listens to them, they are then engaged with the story. They are invested in your success. And at that stage, they become a fan. Once they are a fan, once you think of someone as a fan, I always thought this was fascinating about Wattpad, because it's the first place I've worked that doesn't talk about someone interested in the story as a reader or as a consumer. They are a fan, and fans buy things in lots of different editions. They engage with stories in different ways. So once a fan has engaged with a story, they are likely to go see a movie. They will buy a comic book, and they will buy a printed book, even though they will continue to read that same story on the platform over and over again. They are fans. This means something to them. They are emotionally invested in this story. You can move to the next slide. So these are just some examples of incredible successes that Wattpad has had. There's the After series, but A través de mi ventana is such an incredibly huge success in Spain and worldwide. This has sold over 1 million copies in a year. And there is one Spanish language title that sold 100,000 copies within the first month that it was on sale. There is such an eagerness for these kinds of stories. At this point, I should also mention that an interesting statistic, as I was doing research for this panel, is that worldwide, there are 90 million users of Wattpad. Inevitably, no matter what country you are in, 80%, it's consistently 80% of those readers are between the ages of 14 and 24, and they are young women. So there is something that these women, young women, aren't getting in other forms of stories or book publishing, I think, that is drawing them to this. And I also think that the other interesting thing about that statistic is that is an area where not really many other fandoms are welcoming to that age group, or the fact that they're young women. Some of them may be Marvel fans, but it can be toxic within a comics sense. The only other place where they tend to exist is in manga, which is an interesting crossover with Webtoon, I think. You can go over to the next slide. This is another big example for our success is Heartstopper, which started as a Webtoon. And the last, we don't need to spend too much time on this. Go to the next slide. Lore Olympus, another Webtoon success. Tower of God, huge and published in, I believe at least now it's 10 different languages in 10 different countries. And you can go to the next. And this is just an example of some of the people that we've worked with and have had various partnerships with. Some of these are contractual partnerships, such as Mondadori, Penguin Random House Spain, and Hachette in France. And some are just HarperCollins has published many of our books. We have a good relationship with them, and Simon & Schuster is the same. And I think that's, then we get to our thank you side. I think that's about it. So yeah, go ahead.
Let's talk about this.
Okay.
You have these, relationships that exist for imprints of Wattpad webtoons, but your focus is more on individual titles. And how do you determine which individual stories you're going to move forward with?
There's a couple of ways. There are within the company, there are these creator managers that I mentioned they're constantly reading, and they are constantly looking for content that, yes, they look at the number of reads and how many above a certain amount of reads on any given story. They will, of course, pay attention to it. There are a lot of people engaging with the story. Is this something that we need to look at for publishing rights? That's one part of it. But the other part of it is if they sometimes bring forth a story that they just really like, every week we have a company-wide meeting where we talk about a story that people are excited about. Somebody comes forth and says, I just read the story, I think it's really good. And if entertainment, because we do have in-house entertainment representatives, or our book publishing, or me, we can say, that sounds great, I'd love to work on that. And that's basically how we work on it. And we have people that do that in every different language. So I right now have a list of Italian stories that the authors would really like to have book publishing deals on. And so I will go to these Italian publishers and say, what do you think that this is something you would like to print and release? Because they don't fit Mondadori's program.
Right. Yeah, I think from a rights person point of view, that's a really interesting aspect to your job. Many of us who've worked in American publishing have for years been selling English language books into other markets. And you have this new aspect, which is selling Italian books into Italian markets, Spanish books into Spanish markets. You mentioned there are 30 languages that people are writing in. Is that right?
Yes.
So that opens up a lot of opportunity for local publishing. It's an interesting new prospect from my point of view anyway, that you would be going into local markets with local writers.
I find it to be one of the most fascinating aspects of my job. I think it's really interesting because the partners that we have, and again, that's not my area of specialty within the company, but they tend to pay a lot of attention to particularly book talk. And if it's a story that's mentioned on Book Talk, they will express interest in it. But there's still a lot of misunderstanding about how that works and how that can translate into book sales. It's still something that I think a lot of publishers are trying to grapple with. What does the fan base really look like? Is they don't really, they think that if it's got to be a certain threshold for that to translate into copy sales. And it's a little different. You have to get it while people are just starting to talk about it on Book Talk. And there are very specific, they're also interesting to me because the stories that people are gravitating to, they tend to have some overlap. They're very much romances and young adults, new adults kind of titles, but beyond that, it's very different per region, which I find fascinating. And I think there's so much opportunity for these writers. It makes me really excited to get them into print.
That is really exciting. And when you have, for example, made a deal on a particular title in the local language, let's say, do you then have an opportunity to license that into other languages? Is that happening now?
Yes, the biggest example is the A Través de mi Ventana, which I cannot emphasize enough. It was really shocking to me how huge this book was. Mm-hmm. So it started off as a Wattpad story, and then the author we established this partnership with PRH. They published it. The book got massive. Then Netflix made a movie, and then there is a tour of all of the locations that is in Barcelona, that I met an English editor who was so obsessed that she went to Barcelona to take this tour of the Ariana Godoy tour. And so now I have an offer in the UK for it.
Wow.
And I have an offer in France, and there's all of this possibility to license that then into other places and to understand how foreign language translation works in the opposite direction.
Yeah, interesting. The film deals and TV deals are happening from Wattpad into film. Is that right? Or do they happen?
That's right.
Yeah. So you have a colleague who's the film person who's doing
exactly. It. Yes.
And I really like this mention of fan versus reader. It was one of the first times I realized how we limit ourselves by focusing on reader, by focusing on a person who bought books before. Certainly I'm sure many more imaginative people than I am exist in publishing, and they've thought of the idea of making a whole ecosystem around certain kinds of things. And it happens in young children's books. I know I'm very aware of that, but it's a real note, I think, that you're mentioning this audience of a certain age range of young women who aren't otherwise served in terms of this huge appetite for romance and story, intense story that doesn't really exist elsewhere. That's
Yeah. I agree. And it was one of the things that really, as I said, it's really struck me, because there is fandom. I mean, the root of the word is fanatic. So it really establishes this emotional attachment to something. And it really, of course, it wouldn't work in any other type of genre. It is very much commercial fiction driven, but commercial fiction is based on a story. That's what that's one of the most essential elements of it. It's got to have a good story that carries you through. And I think that it's really interesting that, because I work on both I sell webtoons into other languages in addition to the Wattpad, and it's really interesting that there is an overlap. That I've met several young women who you started out reading Wattpad and they moved on to webtoon, and some of the webtoon stories, again, because they are Korean based and there's something about Korean culture that they're very much interested in, this very emotional love story, these deep emotional love stories. And I think that that is something that traditional publishing misses, or when they try to capitalize on it, they don't do it with respect. And I think even like from the very first time my start at Wattpad, there was a lot of discussion about things like, here are the tropes, here are the subgenres, it's very much understanding what these groups are and how they search and engage with stories. And I do think that that's missing from traditional publishing. I think there has been a lot of, there was a very, we all know, there was a huge time of YA, when YA was very big, but I don't think that I don't know necessarily that publishers respected those stories. I think they appreciated the commercial potential of them, but I don't think that they actually respected them. And I think that's a difference that some online platforms bring to that.
Yeah.
I
was also thinking about, the idea of going out into a marketplace with a quote debut author who already has this tremendous platform. It's something we all seek of our authors. What's your platform? Literally, Wattpad is a platform, and you can go out with statistics and data and evidence in a way that isn't all that usual for a new fiction writer for many agents and publishing rights people. Do you find that the marketing support on Wattpad helps you push? Does it help the book sales? Does it help the film? I mean, how does it all work when a piece of it really is outside of Wattpad?
Oh, it's really, it's very interesting to see how we can put all of that together. I have the breakdowns of how many readers per country and how often they engage with something and what type of readers they are. So there's all kinds of statistics like that. One thing that I always kind of wonder about, because I was a former agent, and it was something that I would always ask whenever, say, a digital audio deal came through, is what does that, how many reads, how many individuals is that? And I don't know, you can't tell that, but what you can tell is, even if it is 100 individuals reading something 94 million times, is probably unlikely. But there are people who aren't reading it over and over again. And because they're reading it over and over again, that can in turn translate to book sales. And I think kind of one thing that I find I have to do, well, that's part of my job, is to interpret those numbers. Because I think when you present numbers that are that big, it's too much for, it's kind of hard to grapple with. You kind of have to break it down. Okay, but this means this, and this is another example where that came through, and with similar numbers, and these are what people are saying about it. And so that means that, sometimes it's emphasizing an element of the story that is reaching out and grabbing people, and therefore that's where your market is, and that's where your marketing should face, and that kind of, finding the element that makes people drawn to it and reread it.
Right. Yeah, I think the potential here in terms of a publisher being interested in terms of an imprint, or being able to understand that audience and continuously reach out, and they're the kind of addictive books that we all know in certain genres have existed for a long time, but this is a kind of more is more approach.
Yeah, it's much more like a comic book approach, I think, because comics, you're engaged with certain characters and certain stories, and then that reaches out into lots of different areas of entertainment.
It's great. So I'm not seeing a ton of questions, and I'm going to indulge in something that I love, and I know you have a good story related to this. I'd just like to hear about creative deals people have made in their lifetimes, ongoing, and how we sometimes think of rights in books very narrowly. There's set kinds of rights we can sell, and set places that we go to, and we're going back to the well all the time, but occasionally something unusual comes up, and I would love for you to tell your unusual tale.
Oh, well, I will tell you my most unusual tale. I will say, before going into that I do think that we should be very creative about how we license rights. I think that and I think that also can kind of tie into creative marketing, which really gets you into it. So my most amusing deal, I negotiated a juggling deal. A juggling deal for one of our clients, because he wrote a science fiction book in which the main character was a juggler, and a juggling company in France decided to license it. And continually license it, so it would be renewed over and over again. And it's much like a theatrical deal. It's a certain number of juggling performances per year or 6 months. I've never seen it. I just Google Robert Silverberg juggling and see what comes up. Let's see what happens. But
to put it out there that, maybe there's a character in a book someone's working on somewhere, and they could find a creative way to license those rights.
Well, I do think it's really, it is like one of the things that I think is really helpful is to see how creative you can be with those kinds of things, because it does bring attention to the work. So
let me just bring it back to Wattpad after that little diversion there that I needed to hear.
Happy to tell that story.
It's a great story about Wattpad, and also a really important thing to think about. I think this idea of fandom and creating an ecosystem around a genre or an author. Just again, an example of different kinds of content and different ways of licensing content. And I just really appreciate you being here today to share that with us.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for having me.
I think if we're ready, Brian, you want to talk a little bit about tools at Bisg? And
I do, and I think that juggling is the right metaphor for anything from the rights committee.
Truth.
So we have a number of people who are on the webinar today who probably are not as familiar with Bisg, but more interested in the topic of rights. I wanted to just take a minute to say that we actually maintain 5 standing committees that meet every month. So collectively about 60 times a year, dealing with different topics. Metadata rights, obviously, is this committee. Subject codes, which is the committee that updates and maintains BISAC, supply chain and workflow. We're here actually today just to share some information about the Rights Committee. So there are several different ways that you can get access to tools and resources. We have 2 standing publications that are current and available. Publishing Rights and Untapped Opportunity was the first white paper to be published by this committee, and it dates to 2017, but it's still really relevant, and it kind of guides a lot of the work that we're doing. And last year we published Finding the ROI in Rights Management Investments, which showed very strongly that better management of rights yields significant returns for publishers and other intermediaries. The first one's available for free for download from the BISG website, and it's free if you're a member for the second one, and I think $25 if not. During the pandemic, we launched a multi-part series on rights education. Several of those sessions are recorded and archived on BISG's YouTube channel. If you go to the website, you can get access to that. We have a sessions scheduled for later next month, and we're going to continue that into 2023 with a calendar that we'll announce. But the thing I'm excited about to do today is actually to announce a 4-part rights FAQ on the BISG website. We actually have done, I'll just switch the share for a second and show you that. So we've done an FAQ for several years for the BISAC subject codes. What we're doing today for the first time is showing you a 4-part FAQ that covers several sets of questions. The first on the language of rights. So here you see the questions, and then generally brief paragraphs that explain each of the answers for that category. We talked specifically about acquiring rights and a set of questions there, as well as selling rights, which is obviously the other side of the coin. And then finally, we have a section that probably will continue to evolve over time on rights best practices. I think everybody wants to know how you determine the value of the book. We don't give you a dollar price. That would put me in association jail. But it's nice to be able to provide this. It's currently available if you go to the BISG website. I'm just going back here. It's at the bottom of a menu for the Rights Committee itself. So when you come all the way top, if it's committees and go to the Rights Committee and scroll down, you can find this. We're going to give it a more prominent position. We've been hiding it for the last several weeks as we test driven it, so that you didn't find it until today. But it's now freely available, and we look forward to both you using it and providing feedback on it. So with that, Kris, I think we'd like to turn it to hear from Nina Sabak, who's, as I said earlier, Director of Research and Editorial at Market Partners International. Both Nina and Market Partners are very good friends of the Book Industry Study Group. We shared an office space until last year, and it's great to have you here today on the program, Nina.
Good to see you. I'm going to share my screen as well because I have some slides to share with everyone. Okay, well, hello and welcome to this morning's presentation. As mentioned, I'm Nina Sabak, Director of Research and Editorial at Market Partners International and editor of MPI's long-running publication, Publishing Trends. Before we begin, I'd like to give you a little context on who we are and what we do. MPI was founded in 1990 as a publishing consulting firm and has worked with trade publishers and retailers, magazines, museums, educational companies, distributors, digital media pioneers, and everyone in between. We're interested in and invested in the future of the industry as a whole, both in America and abroad. Yeah, Publishing Trends, our flagship publication, began as a print newsletter in the 90s and moved online in the 2000s. For decades, it has featured news, data, commentary, and resources intended to be useful to the broader publishing community. Our readers range from industry executives to aspiring authors, and our intended audience includes anyone interested in the business of making books. To put it simply, our readers come from everywhere, and nowhere is this more true than in our most popular recurring feature, international bestsellers. Some of you are presumably already familiar with bestsellers. If you aren't, welcome to my favorite column, and allow me to give you a brief overview. Each month, Publishing Trends posts a set of 6 best-selling fiction charts in different countries. Of these countries, 4 are permanent: France, Germany, Italy, and Spain. The other 2 spots rotate, and featured countries are chosen for a variety of reasons. More on that later. Most recently, we featured Australia and Poland, as you can see here. In 2022, we've also covered Turkey, Singapore, New Zealand, and Bulgaria, to name a few. This feature dates back to Publishing Trends print-only days, and not all of our archives are currently online. However, our site does include charts going back to 2013, as well as a selection of columns from 2003 and 2004. For our purposes today, I'm going to be focusing on the period I've worked on directly, but please do note that more extensive archives are available to you. We encourage you to use them freely. I do want to stress that these columns are intended to be and should be read as snapshots of a particular moment in a particular place. We simply don't have the institutional reach or infrastructural might that a book scan would. Besides, every country's industry operates within that nation's norms and cultural expectations, so raw data is hard to come by. But these impressions are very useful nonetheless, and the snapshots they provide are evocative. I'm going to take you through the construction of a post now, so you can see later what some of these snapshots might mean. I've been the editor and steward of this feature since late 2017, so we're coming up on 5 years worth of trends and observations. Perhaps I'm biased towards my own experience, but I think the last 5 years in particular have been fascinating from an international rights and sales perspective, to say nothing of the period from March 2020 onward. The ways we buy, read, and discuss books have adapted to any number of global challenges, and a good many of our borders have been transformed, if not flattened. I suspect that we'll be studying the pandemic's effects on our industry for a very long time to come. In my 5 years at the helm, though, the way we've aggregated our bestseller lists hasn't changed or become more complicated, so let's walk through that. As previously mentioned, International Bestsellers keeps 4 permanent slots and 2 rotating. Those 4 countries, again, France, Italy, Germany, and Spain, are the largest publishing markets in Europe along with the UK, and they provide a good aggregate view of Western European consumer trends. The 2 rotating countries are chosen for 3 qualities: novelty, relevance, and quality of source. All 3 are equally important. If we don't feel our data lives up to each standard, we don't run it. Novelty. In practice, this means that rotating countries are never repeated more often than once a year. We'd like to provide as global a view as possible by featuring as many different sources as possible. It also means that, broadly speaking, we focus on places with more robust independent markets. Smaller countries with emerging industries are absolutely still of interest, however, especially when we check in over time again and again. As for relevance, I'm using that word here to mean basically the extent to which spotlighting a certain country will illuminate our understanding of the relationships between different international markets. Certain markets, based on their relative maturity and their relationship to the English language, tend to be dominated by a few international companies. Other markets feature more regional publishers and authors. For an example, let's look at Nigeria, which we ran back in June 2018. I'll just pull that chart up so you can see it. Despite its literary output, Nigeria doesn't currently rank among the countries that read the most, or buy the most books, or invest the most into arts education. So in one sense, it's a very unlikely candidate for bestsellers. In another sense, though, it's relevant because it's not hyperconnected or Western. What it can show us is what's outside the bubble. A few things to note here. One, of course, is the dominance of roughly a handful of authors. Out of 10 slots, we have 6 distinct authors, 4 of whom are readily available in America. The lack of language barrier is helpful. A francophone country like Chad to the east would obviously require translation. So we do have some exchange, Ted Decker from America and Ben Okri from Nigeria, despite the distance, both physical and cultural. Second is the dominance of the Big Five and their imprints. Vintage, Knopf, Center Street, Thomas Nelson, these are familiar names to us, and you'll notice that these companies are publishing in both Nigeria and the US. There's no need for a transfer of rights, as with Grove picking up the baton from Faber and Penguin in the #1 and #2 slots. So the Western industry, if not the American industry specifically, makes its footprint known. After all, PRH has resources for distribution that a smaller domestic press might still be working to establish. And third, briefly, is Lulu at #3. Self-publishing platforms and fan-driven platforms like Lulu and Wattpad are not constants on the list, but they appear often enough to deserve notice. The same trend we've seen in America of self-published authors matching the sales of traditionally published authors, your E.L. Jameses and Andy Weirs, is true worldwide. Anecdotally, Italy in particular tends to have a Wattpad bestseller somewhere in the rankings. So Anthony Anugba is representative of that shift away from the traditional industry. We've covered novelty and relevance, and that leaves quality of source. As I've mentioned, the 2 rotating countries are chosen based on what data is available to us. If there isn't good data for country X, we'll look into country Y. Truly, finding a source is the most crucial part of the whole enterprise, and we're quite open about where we're finding our information. On each chart and in the downloadable PDF summarizing each month, we list the relevant newspaper or bookstore, whether it's Le Monde or Kinokuniya. One of the major problems we encounter here is one of categorization. This is most often, though not universally true, in markets that operate outside of Romance languages. A Chinese bookstore, for example, might list Chinese language books separately from imported books in other languages and translate them into Chinese. And because these sites are not providing raw sales data, it becomes very difficult to construct a sort of net sales list combining national and international sales. After all, we're interested in how these books do relative to one another. If Colleen Hoover is doing well under the English language subcategory of a Turkish vendor, that's one thing. If she's the best-selling author overall, that's another. That's probably the most frequently recurring difficulty in the research stage for these posts. It's generally not that difficult to find a reasonably high-profile source for book sales and bestsellers, but it is difficult to find a reasonably high-profile source that combines overall sales for translated and non-translated literature, and we're really trying to cover both. This is why certain countries like Egypt, my personal white whale, haven't appeared in the column, at least not under my tenure. We have yet to find an appropriate source. But another problem has to do with the category of fiction itself. What counts as adult fiction is a little slippery. If John Green makes the charts in Spain, does it matter that we might call him a young adult author here? What about Rupi Kaur, who was marketed in America as a poet? These are judgment calls, and if we can't be scientific, at least we can be consistent. In general, we respect the stance of the original source. So occasionally you will see titles on the charts that might be classified differently in the New York Times. Is it autofiction or memoir? If Der Spiegel says it's autofiction, that's that. I'll note, though, that we don't run children's titles or manga simply because both are relatively far afield from our stated focus. The children's and manga markets are huge and fascinating, but they're different beasts. That said, there may come a time when that policy comes to feel artificial. We reevaluate as we go. Once we've collected our top 10, there are two things left to do to the chart. The first is translation as appropriate. If there's no English language edition of a book, we translate its title as literally as possible while preserving whatever idiom might be in use. The second is to match the books to their American editions, if they exist. For this, I find Goodreads really invaluable. It's very simple to use the site to search for other editions of a given title, which means not just paperback versus hardcover, but Armenian, Portuguese, or Thai. Goodreads, being owned by Amazon, has robust language support and an innate incentive to work globally. As a database, it's more comprehensive than you might have imagined, especially if you know Goodreads primarily as a social platform. And once we've got our titles and editions straightened out, the rest is a matter of formatting. Since February 2021, we've run the charts along with a downloadable PDF of that month's data. This was suggested to us from an accessibility standpoint, and it's now a standard feature. So that's how a given bestsellers column is made. Now let's walk through what those columns suggest to us. As I was just saying, we focus specifically on fiction, and there are a few good reasons for this. One is simply that a limit must be drawn somewhere. We do periodically get requests for more coverage of different genres, for example, children's or graphic fiction, or adult nonfiction and self-help. This is unlikely to happen, if only because bestsellers is, as I've mentioned, one feature among several, and we simply don't have the resources to dedicate to more ambitious coverage at this time. So we limit our reach to what we can cover effectively. But still, why fiction? As a category, fiction is by and large read for leisure rather than for professional or educational reasons. A chart of top-selling grammar workbooks would be interesting, I suppose, but only to a very limited audience. By looking at how the reading public chooses to spend its leisure time, we can try to make out the shape of what matters in this moment, what questions these consumers are asking, what trends they're absorbing, and even, as we watch titles travel from list to list, how their cultures are speaking to one another. For example, Freshwater for Flowers originally appears on the French chart at number 7 in June 2019, listed under its original title, which we translated literally, if not poetically, as Change the Water of the Flowers. The next month, it moves up to number 3, where it stays until October. In fact, it remains on the French chart through February 2020. And then in May of that year, it appears at number 6 in Italy, where it remains without interruption until January 2022. In July and August of this year, it was back on the Italian charts. We also see it make a cameo at number 1 in Norway in February 2022. Since Norway is a rotating country, we don't have longitudinal data for it, but it's still a notable illustration of the book's spread across Europe. You've noticed, I'm sure, that we retitled the book on our website as Freshwater for Flowers in October 2019. It's around this time that the Europa Editions translation begins showing up on Goodreads as forthcoming. I think you can see it here. And that version does eventually release in America in June 2020. It's not at all uncommon for a translated book to be retitled in the target language, and we always refer to the bestsellers by whatever title is most accurate to an English-speaking audience. If you see a title change like this, that generally indicates an announced stateside acquisition and not a whim on our part. And those changes are important data points, of course, especially if you're interested in translation timelines. Of course, books also move from America, not just to America. Culturally, we tend to export far more than we import, which is the topic for a different presentation. It's broadly true, and I imagine uncontroversial, to say that Americans tend to read titles that were first published in English, if not written by other Americans. So a few familiar names and titles do pop up, and I'd be remiss not to mention now 2 titles that continue to do very well domestically, The Song of Achilles and Where the Crawdads Sing. I've chosen these 2 for our examination because these books have reached the American charts and stayed there for different reasons. I imagine you're familiar, but just to refresh. Where the Crawdads Sing was published in August 2018 by G.P. Putnam's Sons. As of this moment, it has sold some 15 million copies total. Film adaptation was released earlier this year. The book has been on the New York Times bestseller list for 178 weeks and counting, and its arc is familiar in shape, if not duration, a debut novel that has steadily burned its way to the top. Then there's The Song of Achilles. Originally published by Echo in 2011, it sold respectably and even earned the 2012 Orange Prize for Fiction before settling into backlist territory. And then, to make a long story short, in 2021, Book Talk. The Song of Achilles became a #1 New York Times bestseller a full decade after its first publication. Total sales of the Echo edition recently topped 2 million. The original print run was 20,000. As an aside, this industry has already spent a lot of ink on the influence of Book Talk on American sales, but I'd be very interested to see research on how it's shaping the market abroad. TikTok, after all, is a Chinese-owned company with a global reach, and the way it can consolidate fandoms and therefore market force across national borders is going to be interesting to watch. Back to our 2 titles, though. Where the Crawdads Sing first appears on our charts in May 2019, number 7 in New Zealand. In August, it's in Australia. I saw that there was a question from Alice about the Australian market, and I can say that this was one of our constant bestsellers. We tend to have a lot of crossover between American and Australian bestsellers. And in October, it's in Germany, translated and published by Hanser Blau. After this, we see it continue to appear in English language markets like New Zealand, but also fairly consistently to this day in Germany. It also pops up in a good many rotating countries in the last 2 years, which suggests the scale of the phenomenon. Israel, Romania, France, the Philippines, Hungary, and Greece each feature Delia Owens at one point or another. Meanwhile, The Song of Achilles first appears in April 2021 at number 5 in Italy. To give you an idea of the turnaround here, the domestic sales spike began on August 9th, 2020, after the original TikTok mentioning the book. So just over 6 months later, an Italian edition of this backlist American book has become a bestseller, and it remains an Italian bestseller through March 2022. There are also appearances in Greece, which was perhaps inevitable, as well as Singapore, Poland, Mexico, and Russia. We'll touch on Russia again in a moment. Again, the range of countries here and the number of translations that would be required gives you a sense of scale. Of course, I would love to, at this moment, reveal the secret to reading these charts predictably, so that the next blockbuster comes as no surprise to you. But again, the charts are snapshots. My predictions are provisional at best, but I do see certain recurring patterns. First, as previously mentioned, self-published and non-traditionally published authors. Wattpad in particular continues to accrue cultural power, as we've just heard. Amazon has exclusivity for certain titles. The balance of power between author and publisher has shifted, and it has shifted globally. Most self-published titles don't gain this kind of momentum that we've seen on the charts, but the momentum is still very real. Second, and perhaps this goes without saying, the continued dominance of book talk. In recent months, we've been seeing Colleen Hoover's climb the charts worldwide, just as they've been dominating the American lists. Book talk is connecting readers globally, and their buying habits follow suit. Third, consumers don't buy in a vacuum, and geopolitics shape these lists too. Take Russia, for example, which seems to perpetually list 1984 and Brave New World among its bestsellers. Or Ukraine, whose chart was dominated by Western fantasy when we last featured it in July 2021. And keep an eye on Italy, whose most recent election will likely be reflected in the charts for some time to come. And lastly, most basic of all, certain authors seem to hit the charts and stay there for any number of reasons. Fresh Water for Flowers is only one of the titles I've seen over and over during my time with this column. Books with that kind of staying power could be of great interest to the appropriate press. If you're trying to buy the future, look to the present. All of this is just an introduction to the data we've been collecting, and I'm sure you'll find ways to use it beyond what I've described here. We hope you do use it, and we hope you continue to give us your feedback on how this feature is working for you and how it can be improved. To that end, I'd like to close with a kind of call to action. As discussed earlier, our major challenge with bestsellers is sourcing. If you have a suggestion for a better source than we've been using, or if you know a source for a country we haven't yet featured, I would love to hear from you. And if you have cultural context that you feel is important, maybe this newspaper has a bias we aren't aware of, maybe that bookstore overrepresents certain publishers or is owned by one of them, that's very useful for us to know going forward. We're Americans, for better or worse, and the more globally conscious we can be, the better bestsellers will be. Thank you very much for your attention, and I imagine we have time for questions now. You muted, Brian.
Thank you, Nina. It wouldn't be a Zoom webinar if one of us didn't forget.
Authentic.
Thanks. One of the questions that came in was how do you manage this? Because you're making a lot of this information available for free. It's a significant. It sounds like a really significant commitment of time and attention within MPI.
It is. Publishing Trends is a free resource that we make freely available. MPI, in its other lives, is a consulting firm. We do more specific projects with specific publishers or entities related to publishing. I'm the director of Research and Editorial, which means that I manage the website, but I do have a hand in those projects as well. But MPI isn't just me. So I'm generally free to run the website as I see fit, and then we do our less free projects as well.
Great. Well, I mean, again, Lara Allen's juggling metaphor, I think, plays a role in it. You've got your hands in a lot of different projects. The second thing is there, maybe you mentioned this in your presentation, I missed it. Is there a country or a set of countries that I think you identified one white whale, but are there countries that you would love to be able to get more support on, or you just haven't been able to crack based upon the criteria that you use?
Egypt I mentioned because I found bookstore sources for the bestsellers, but they separate their titles, as I've mentioned. And I'd love to run an aggregated list of overall bestsellers. There are certain countries that I would love language support on. For example, Japan, just because since I'm translating, I'm not always confident in my ability to translate effectively. And Japan's titles I found to be a little bit tricky. But I'm mostly interested in sources outside of Western Europe because those are relatively easy to find. So if you've got a lesser represented country that you think still illuminates something about the industry. I mean, I ran Nigeria, and I believe, Brian, that you gave me guff at the time. So I think that any country would be interesting to us at Bestsellers.
I'm sure it was all good-natured.
Oh, I'm sure.
Yeah. Kris, anything else that you wanted to jump in before we thank Nina?
No, I think just thank you, Nina. It's been a favorite of mine for a long time, that comparison and trying to understand how books migrate across the world. I think it's a good lesson for people who maybe don't know that much about rights, that books can start in one place and it is a long journey. It's not common that books are published simultaneously globally. And even if they are, it's not necessarily true that they hit exactly the same way in each country. And I think that's what you're really helping us see. I would like it all turned into a giant database so that we can work it in a different way, but that's again a different story for another time.
Whenever I have an intern next, we'll talk.
Yes, good.
Yeah,
Thank
well,
you. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us from Pittsburgh.
My pleasure.
Thanks. So Kris, I think you want to be in conversation next with Scott Hoffman of International Literary Properties, which acquires and manages a portfolio of literary estates.
Yes. Hi, Scott. Welcome. We're so happy you're here.
Thank you. Fascinating event so far.
Great. We can just dive right in. You and I had a little bit of a preliminary chat, and again, the framework for this is a different way of seeing rights. It's either a lens or a twist on the kaleidoscope. And I think International Literary Properties at its core is a new kind of management of a portfolio of IP. And I just want you to talk a little bit. Why don't you start with how it all began?
Sure. Well, I might as well start with what it is we actually do.
There you go.
So International Literary Properties, of which I'm the chief executive officer, acquires copyrights and or cash flows from living authors, the estates of authors who have passed away, and in certain cases, literary agents or other profit participants in the industry. And my partners and I started this business. It was born from the fact that in just about every other established industry on the planet, at some point in their career, when somebody has built something of value, there exist established mechanisms for them to get compensated for it and to turn over the management to somebody else who will compensate them for it and preserve their legacy. So, if you're a doctor who's got a medical practice and you want to retire when you're 75 years old, probably another group of physicians will come along, will buy out your practice, will take over your patients, and will take good care of them, which presumably is very important to you. Same thing if you own a car dealership. At the end of when you're ready to be done with the business, somebody will come along and will buy it from you. So we do that for authors. I come from a rights background. I started a literary agency called Folio Literary Management in 2006, and after I'd sold my first books and I saw the royalty statements come in, it reminded me of two things. One is one of my all-time favorite books, which is Liar's Poker by Michael Lewis, in which he talks about the creation of the mortgage-backed securities market in the 1980s at Salomon Brothers with Louis Ranieri and John Goodfriend and what they were doing back then. And at the same time, all sorts of interesting things were happening with music publishing rights as an investment category. You had Michael Jackson buying the Beatles catalog. You had David Bowie floating those Bowie bonds on the market, and it seemed like such a fascinating idea to me because for my authors, their copyrights were the most valuable thing that they own, and there was no market available for them to be able to trade those copyrights. So I started looking for somebody who was going to be in this business to acquire royalties in exchange for cash up front, and it turns out that nobody was really doing it in the United States. It had been done once or twice before. Probably the most famous example happened in 1964 when Jock Campbell, who was running the Booker organization, bought 51% of Ian Fleming's royalties, and they then started a division at Booker to do a bunch more acquisitions of literary properties, and in fact, they own some of the estates that we now own, like the Georgette Heyer estate, for instance. But we've been in business for about 3 years. We've acquired 35 plus estates, haven't announced all of them. And we own either the copyrights or the cash flows from more than 2,000 titles from authors like James M. Cain, who wrote Double Indemnity, Postman Always Rings Twice, George Simenon, Evelyn Waugh, Marjorie Allingham, I mentioned Heyer, the estate of Langston Hughes, and tons of others. So that's sort of the business in a nutshell, how it came into being, and it's also born from the notion that if there's one universal truth in the book business that I learned as an agent, it's that authors always need money. And we provide we provide them with that option. So, if you're an author and you want to buy a house and you go to the bank and you say, hey bankers, I'd like a mortgage, but instead of pledging the house as collateral, I'd like to pledge my copyrights. They'll look at you like you have 5 heads. But we understand what books are. We understand how to manage them. We add value to the process when we get involved in active management. And are building a business that we know will become a permanent part of the literary ecosystem.
Yeah, that's really great. I think this idea of being able to pass on, it happens. There could be heirs. There aren't necessarily going to be heirs who are interested in managing the copyrights or know anything about the book business or have any sense of how that should work going forward. And also little understanding about the volatility of royalties, which can go up and of course can go down. One of the things you do, I think, is remove that risk.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And we don't specialize in a specific genre or even in a specific geographic area. We're hoping to build a broad portfolio. So that in the case that if we wind up with seeing children's royalties or seeing picture book royalties go down, perhaps prescriptive nonfiction will be going up at the same time, and hopefully it will equalize across our platform. But if you're an author whose entire retirement plan is relying on royalties, and your book happens to be in one of the sectors that goes down, that's a risk that we can take away from you.
Yes. Now, I think you also mentioned to me that in many cases you're acquiring partial ownership, and so there is continuing involvement from the authors or the author's estate. And I just thought it was important to point out that you continue to work with existing literary agents, with existing publishers. This is a kind of creation of a new role in publishing that certainly exists in other businesses. You're a manager. In a way.
Yeah, very much so. I guess you can sort of look at it like the Hollywood distinction between agent and manager. And in that situation, we very much play the role of manager. But you mentioned a bunch of good points. We do not do any agenting ourselves, although I come from an agenting background. It's not our core competency. We don't have the staff to do it. We buy backlist and we buy successful backlist. And we feel that for a book to become interesting to us, the team has to already have been working. We're not looking to disrupt the book business. We're really just looking to add something to it and provide other options for authors. So whenever we acquire a property, we have a hard and fast rule to stick with whoever the incumbent literary agent is. We sign their standard agency agreement. We pay standard agency commissions. And the only thing that really changes is that where we acquire the rights, we're the ones who are signing translation contracts or signing film options rather than the author. When we started the business, we thought we were going to acquire 100% of everything, and that's quick. We quickly learned that wasn't the case. We underestimated the extent to which people feel an emotional connection to works of literature. They're not commodity goods to be traded and sold. These are works that people have put their heart and soul in, and they're important not just to their creators, but to a whole universe of readers. And so very often what we will do is we'll buy a fractional share of an estate. We very much like doing that when the author is alive, because he or she obviously has the most knowledge and of their work and what it means and why it's important. But we also really like the historical perspective that having heirs to authors brings to the table. So, for instance, the George Simenon estate we co-own with John Simenon, who is George's son. And for those of you who are not familiar with Simenon, besides Shakespeare and the Bible, there have probably been more Simenon books sold than any other. 700 million copies worldwide, most of them in European languages: Italian, German, Spanish, French. Simenon himself was Belgian and wrote in French, so he's not as big here yet in the U.S. as he should be, but that's going to change.
Yeah, his Inspector Maigret, is that how you say it?
Yes.
Is a really great character. I I have read a few of those in English, but that's an example of something where you're really thinking through how to globally, I guess it's not true in every case that you're bringing something up. In some cases, you're managing an existing base, but in this case, you're really looking into new opportunities, as I understand it, and you have some important in-house relationships or existing relationships that maybe you should talk about.
Yeah, sure. Let me might as well talk about our team a little bit. Everybody on the ILP team comes from a rights background of some sort. The five of us who founded the company were myself, Ted Green, who's now our executive chairman. Ted's a serial entrepreneur. He used to run Polygram Music Publishing. He ran a video distribution company called Anchor Bay. He owned Image Entertainment, and while he owned Image acquired Acorn, the British mystery and drama streaming service. Acorn had the opportunity under Ted's tenure to purchase 2/3 of the Agatha Christie estate, and that's really got Ted interested in the literary estates business. So Ted and I were two of the people who had the original idea, as well as Bob Benton, who's on our board. Bob comes from a City of London background, but he's been a theater investor and producer for more than a decade. Hilary Strong, who's our UK and Europe CEO, comes from a film and television background. Before that, she was actually the CEO of the Agatha Christie estate, so she's got that estate management experience. She was one of the top lawyers at Mischief Screen, and is just a film and television expert. So we bring a lot of things to the table for the properties in which we invest. One of the things, for instance, is we've got a first look television deal with the BBC and their 14 affiliated in-house production companies, which kind of gives us a fast track to get properties that we're involved in made well and brought to the screen. I know that anybody who's tried to work in the film and television, books to film and TV process is aware of the immense amount of time it takes, the extraordinary frustration that you go through, only to see maybe one project in 100 wind up on the air. We do considerably better than that. We've got one TV series on the air right now. That's Nicholas Freeling's Van der Valk, which has just been greenlit for its 3rd season. We've got a major feature film in theaters starring Gerard Depardieu, based on Simenon's Inspector Maigret. And then we've got about 15 other projects in active development, many of which we're sure are going to wind up on the air. So we've also got a great in-house development team. We don't do any production ourselves, but we do a really deep dive into the DNA of the estates we acquire, what makes them important, what their fans really love, what could be changed or updated for a modern audience, and what absolutely positively has to stay the same way because it's critical to the identity of the work. We never want to do anything that the original author wouldn't have approved of. We really do look at ourselves as legacy managers, and that value is important to us. We put together Bibles for each of the estates that we acquire, where we talk about which rights have been placed in which territories, whether there have been films or television shows made, and who the main characters are, how some of the stories perhaps that were written in the golden age in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s could be updated to be relevant to modern audiences. And that approach very often gets us in the door at a very high level with producers and distributors, and allows us to accelerate the process.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, I know from experience working at companies that have existed for long periods of time, being able to package up that backlist and develop the deep knowledge can really make a difference in terms of how things move forward in terms of new deals. And I'm guessing, in some cases, you're even acquiring copyrights that would be spread across multiple companies, where it wouldn't be easy for someone else other than a stakeholder to gather up all that information.
Yeah. That's true. A lot of what we do is just pure legwork of figuring out where these rights are, who holds them, which are encumbered, which are available, which have been reverted, which haven't, which books are out of print, which are in print. And one of the things that I really love about what ILP does, and that I longed to be able to do when I was an agent, is that we have the luxury of being able to treat backlist as if it's front list. Agents, publishers have to be so focused on getting the new deal. They've got to do the auction. They've got to get that table placement. They've got to get on the list. And for us, we really get the opportunity to take a look at these sometimes neglected or forgotten titles that are extraordinary, and bring them back to a new audience. For us, we spend a lot of marketing money. We do a lot of digital marketing. We run Amazon ads, we run Google ads, we do a lot of social media marketing. And that's something for backlist that publishers just don't do. It's something that literary agents just can't do economically. When you're getting 15% of 15%, the numbers just don't work out. But for us, when we're getting the whole royalty, it really does make sense for us to put resources behind our catalog.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting also. That I just want to highlight what you said about legwork, because that's applicable to all of us as rights people. It's that hard work of digging back into the record. I'm hoping you have a good system, all you rights people out there, so you can see, what did you license? Is it now 7 years later? Should it be terminated? Did it ever earn out? Did you get your royalties in all the right periods that you were supposed to? Do they match up in terms of actual math to what you received? I mean, that kind of hard work has to be done, and that kind of attention can really result in opportunities. So I just wanted to highlight that that's part of what.
Yeah, it's huge, and there's a lot of value just in actively staying on top of the entire rights situation.
Yeah.
We have a great department in-house that does that, but we're also very, very grateful for our literary agency partners, who are some of the best agents in the world and do that for us. So like on the Kliemann catalog, for instance, PFD Caroline Michelle is our agent. For Georgette Heyer, Peter Buckman at Ampersand was the agent, and so he continues to represent the Heyer estate. We acquired the Ed and Rebecca Emberley catalogs, and Rick Richter at Avitas was the agent for that, and he continues to represent us. That's a pretty interesting story, actually. Ed Emberley is now 89 years old. Unfortunately, he's not in great health. But Caldecott Medal winning illustrator. His most famous work is probably Go Away, Big Green Monster. And has been successful, has delighted kids and their parents for decades. He had all of this artwork that was sitting in drawers that wasn't being used. And so when ILP came in, we invested in the catalog, and we had all of those resources digitized. We put together a style guide, and we're now branding the Emberley catalog as everything Emberley, the way that the Richard Scarry folks have done, the way that the Eric Carle folks have done. We're in talks right now for the first book in the Big Green Monster series that's going to be created not by Ed himself to come out. So we're ensuring that brand that brand outlives him. We're negotiating some merchandising deals for some Halloween merchandise with a household name retailer, and we're thrilled to be working on a daily basis with Rebecca, who is Ed's daughter, who's our partner in this endeavor.
Yeah, and again, first of all, the range, we're talking George Simenon and Ed Emberley, that, not a lot of people have that in their portfolio, but also that full 360-degree look at the kinds of rights that exist in this world and the opportunities that can exist. So in the case of a children's author like that, and maybe even in some cases with adult authors, you have, the merchandising opportunities, the different kinds of products that could be out there in the world, the holiday angles.
For sure. It's
this deep look, that I really appreciate into the types of rights and really matching it with the content.
Yeah. One of our most recent acquisitions was the estate of Anne Rule, who is probably the best known true crime writer of all time. And her Stranger Beside Me is a classic. About her friendship with Ted Bundy before anybody knew that he was a serial killer. But one of the things, and then in that one we're partnered with Leslie Rule, who's Anne's daughter. There are all sorts of things that haven't been done with the Rule books. There's never been a podcast, and given the insatiable appetite for true crime content, that's something that we're actively pursuing right now, and that will increase the notoriety of the Rule name. It'll bring in a whole new universe of people to read the books. And we hope that it's going to be the first step in making sure that the Rule name lasts for decades to come.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, that's the other thing. Copyright is long. Well, people like to debate that, but
yeah, well, true.
But generally you're talking, life of the author
Life plus 70, yeah.
And, making sure that this value adheres for that period of time is again, something that we don't all, in our front list mentality, we don't all think about. And looking at an author's whole career. I know agents do regularly look at an author's whole career and try to make it. And for publishers who've had longevity with an author, that can also become an important piece. But the long-term thinking is a big part of what can make a difference for a company and an author. And I appreciate that you guys are looking at that too.
The one thing that's been most challenging in growing this business is the fact that it's such a new concept to most people in the literary world. When we started, we faced and to a certain extent we still do face the 5 most dangerous words in the book business, and those are nobody's ever done that before. And so, I think when we first started, people thought that we were going to be a flash in the pan. I know that there's unfortunately a history of unscrupulous types in the past trying to take advantage of authors by offering them pennies on the dollar for their copyrights, or publishers trying to grab for copyrights rather than just taking licenses. And we exist to sort of drive all of those players out of the market by making sure that we pay a fair price, that we're open, that we're transparent, and that we're really just that we're compensating authors for the full value of these amazing things that they've created. So, I mean, we've done deals for 6 figures, we've done deals for 7 figures for catalogs, we've even done deals for 8 figures, and we've got some 9-figure offers out now. So it's been a real blast building this business and growing the portfolio and entering into all these relationships, these amazing relationships with authors and their families.
Great. Yeah, that's really great. I was going to say that, you're making it sound so attractive. A lot of other people will get in this business. Of course, the 7, 8, and 9-figure offers do come to the point where it's just not for anybody to get into.
Yeah, in fact, in 2009, when I first had the idea, I thought it would be a great business. I just didn't know where to go to raise the money. And fortunately, my current business partners have those kinds of relationships, and so we're able to bring enough capital to the table to be able to do it at scale and to be able to pay really fair prices for this stuff.
That's great. Brian, are there questions?
Actually, one question that came in just shortly before you started on this topic was, how do you fund the acquisitions? Is it an investment in a specific property, or is it funders for the whole enterprise?
Yeah, so every deal is different. Every deal is bespoke. And what we do is we start with a conversation with whoever the rights owner is about what they want to do, what's important to them. Is it legacy management? Is it maximizing cash up front? Is it retaining some control or say in how the property is managed? We generally prefer, even when we do fractional investments, to invest in all the titles because the work that we do to raise the author's profile, the marketing stuff that we do, that rising tide tends to lift all boats, and we want to make sure that we at least get a chance to participate in that. So in most cases, when we say we own 75%, it's not that we own 75% of the titles, it's that we own 75% of 100% of the titles. And we found that model seems to be the most fair. Our goal when we do that is always to have the share that the author or the author's family retains increase in value so that it becomes worth what 100% was at the beginning. So everybody wins.
That's great. That's great. But you're not having outside investors. I can't invest.
No, unfortunately not. We've raised a bunch of equity from household name asset management companies. And whenever we do business with people, we talk about who's backing us. The company is controlled by the management, by me, Ted, Hillary, Bob, and Andrew McGow, who's our CFO. And we all love books. I mean, I was the 13-year-old kid who was delighted to get a flashlight for Christmas so that I could keep reading books under the covers when my parents made me turn the lights out. So I'm in this business. One, it's a great business, but I'm in it because books have this enormous emotional resonance for me, and I think that they're one of the most important things in our culture.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks. Really great hearing about this. Brian, you had more to say?
Go ahead.
No, I
just
just
want
one
to say
brief.
that I just want to say that that if anybody wants to get in touch with me about this to learn more, or if you're interested in exploring something, our website is ilpliterary.com, and my email address is scott@ilpliterary.com.
Perfect. Thank you, Scott. Thanks.
All right.
There was just one brief question that was, and some of this might be secret sauce, but how do you fill your pipeline? And is there an opportunity, for example, Nina Sabak was talking about the work that she does to track what's happening in different marketplaces. You clearly are looking beyond just the U.S. market. So how do you handle that?
Yeah, we've got a great acquisition staff. Molly Cusick leads it in North America. Mary Durkin leads it in the UK, and we've just hired somebody to run our European acquisitions program. So these are all people who've got long histories in the book business. We're very well connected internally. We've done a tremendous amount of outreach to other stakeholders. So we've met with tons of literary agents. We've met with tons of attorneys who specialize in the book business. We've met with wealth managers who have a lot of literary clients, a lot of estate attorneys who operate in this area, and are basically building a portfolio through shoe leather by going out there, just talking to tons of people, identifying some of the properties that we would love to own, contacting the owners and seeing if they're interested. Sometimes they are, sometimes they're not, but we're out there every day knocking on doors and looking for leads.
Thank you for making the time today. It's been really informative and I think in a lot of ways eye-opening.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks, Scott.
So Kris, I had one other slide that I just wanted to leave with people to give them some ideas about how to follow up with us.
Great.
Building a little bit on the information that we provided earlier. One option is to become part of the Rights Committee. It's led by Kris Kliemann, and it normally comes with Bisg membership. But if you're interested but not quite sure it's for you, you can test drive the value of participation. Leave us a note at that email address, info@bisg.org, and we'll get you added to the committee. You can try it for a few months and see if you like it. I'd be shocked if you didn't. Second thing is to catch up with our content. The publications are downloadable via the website. They're either free or nominal charge. Do check out both our recorded and our upcoming educational webinars. We're trying to advance the industry's understanding of rights as well as their understanding of the potential for rights. And the newly published FAQ is definitely worth checking out. And the last piece is to give us feedback, not just on this program, although certainly that, but just on the issues and challenges that you're facing. The committee is small, but as we describe it, mighty. It gets quite a bit done. And we try to respond to both what we see and what we hear in the industry. So your direction is really important. Even if you can't be a part of the Rights Committee, your input can be. So, Kris, I don't know if you have any thoughts on the nearly 2 hours that we spent on the evolving landscape for rights tools and models.
I'm so grateful for everyone who participated. It's really, I think, eye-opening to look around and see how people are doing the business of rights. And it's something that we do talk about in the committee meetings. We're always looking at what's going on, how is it happening, what's changing. We need to stay at the front of all of this. And as Brian mentioned, we are also working on various projects. So if that's something that interests you, to be able to be working on a project with a group of other rights people that can help lift rights in a variety of ways. For example, we're talking about building a royalty statement standard, at this point focused very much on translation rights deals and royalties coming from a new language publisher into an original language publisher. That's a project we're working on and hope to bring to the industry. We're developing a directory of imprints for all publishers, so that when someone's looking for permission for a book they're holding in their hand and it says a name on it that's not familiar, how will they know where to go? They can check our imprint directory. So there are all kinds of large and small projects to work on. This education initiative is really dear to our hearts. The FAQs are up, and I expect that to be a living, breathing document. I look forward to questions from people. And I look forward to, heaven knows, if you see an answer that you think can be improved, please let us know. That was written and created by the committee and Brian's tremendous input. So we want to keep that going. So I hope that you'll continue to follow us and come on along to some of our meetings, be part of our working group, and certainly I hope you can be a part of our ongoing webinars and seminars. The next one's on copyright. We'll be announcing information about that soon.
And I just want to echo your thanks to Willem, to Pamela, who's always been a significant benefit for us in bringing her perspective to BISG and the Rights Committee work, to Lara, Nina, of course, has been a longtime friend of both BISG and just the very questions about what's happening outside the US market, and to Scott. And most importantly, I think I'd like to thank you, Kris. You put your heart and soul into both planning and creating this webinar far more than I think we had initially anticipated, but you shaped it in a way that really does bring a perspective to the business. And for the folks who are here, I think they've already seen it. There's some comments in the Q&A, but I think as well, the folks who are viewing this recording will come away with a much deeper understanding of where we're going in terms of rights opportunities.
Great. Great. Thank you. Thanks, everybody.